recorded. Yeah, so there you go. You'll be able to refer to friends of yours who have not been able to join us right now. We'll send that out later. Welcome to everyone. We have a pretty good agenda for the day. Allow me to say that I'm speaking to you from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin people, sometimes known as Ottawa, I suppose, by settlers. We're very pleased that people have been able to join us. I know that there are several who are joining us right now as we begin. Basically, we'll do a little bit of an introduction to the meeting and let you know how the agenda is set up. It's important, and I think everyone knows that this last year, at the end of 2022, we saw important climate conferences being held, both the COP27 on climate change in Egypt, as well as biodiversity COP, referred to as COP15 in Montreal itself. Several of the people on this at this event with us today were in Montreal, and the Canadian faith groups sent, many people as well as environmental groups at the COP in Egypt. The issue for Joint Ecological Ministries, which is really an organization of Catholic religious orders and friends who are trying to develop issues around ecological justice, was how do we follow up? And we're very, very pleased that we have two wonderful speakers to lead us on some of the key actions that can follow and allow us to advocate for ecological justice. And you're going to meet them as the day proceeds. We'll have their presentations and some time for further questions. So to begin our event in the right way, I'd like to turn things over to Joan Atkinson, who joins us from London, Ontario. Joan.
Thank you, Joe. Whoops. Oh. Don't know what happened there, but anyway, whether you can see me or not, I'll begin with simply say that I'm delighted to see so many people join with us on a Friday afternoon. That's a strong commitment to the work we are all trying to do. But I'd like to acknowledge first the land acknowledgement, remembering that all of us live and work and pray on the traditional territory of our Indigenous peoples. And so I will speak to the part of territory where I live, but invite everybody to just be aware of whether you know the correct names or all the groups that gather in the area where you live and work, just hold them together. So I acknowledge the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Luanapiak, and the Attawandaron. We honor and respect the history, languages, and cultures of diverse Indigenous people who call this land their home. The area of London is currently home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. And as a settler on this land, I am grateful to have the opportunity to work and live among these people and in this territory. And so as we begin, we've all had probably, I think I'm safe in assuming, a full and busy week. And so rather than add a lot of words to this beginning, I'd simply like to invite us to sit quietly and move inside, or imagine those favorite places that you like to visit. And I'm just going to ask a few questions. There'll be a little bit of music playing, and hope that it helps us just open ourselves to however the messages of today touch us and move us to honor the beautiful creation and diversity that exists among us.
John, if you're playing music, we can't hear it.
Take a few moments to quiet your mind and try to open your hearts. Let the simple picture on the screen speak to your imagination and memory. The opening and the change of the dandelion. The seeds that are carried by the wind.
Bud?
To what today do I need to open myself? What messages do the seeds invite me to hear? To see. And to touch. We know our earth holds much beauty and it is threatened in many ways. And so together, to risk this journey to save our common home and face the future, simply to walk in faith. And there are no linear words that capture the massive mystery of our God. We stand together clothed in grace and showered with blessings. At times we see the flecks of light. And at other times we see only the shadow of the silhouette. But always, both in our knowing and unknowing, we are escorted into tomorrow by love, who gives us everything we need. And so, God of mystery, we open the doors of our minds and hearts. Send your spirit of wisdom and insight to be with us this afternoon. And help us remember that it is your power working in us that can do more than we can ever ask or imagine. Open us to this mystery and blessing. Amen.
Thank you, Joan. Good way to start, indeed. I'd like to introduce Sue Wilson from London, Ontario, to give us a little bit of a framing for the discussion we're about to have today. So over to you, Sue, please.
Thanks, Joe, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to give some context to our webinar today using two different lenses. So the first one is interconnection, and the second one, transformation. So interconnection, the very fact that we've brought together the topic of COP27, the Conference on Climate Change, and COP15, the Conference on Biodiversity Protection, speaks to the intersection of these issues. For example, we know that as the global temperature rises due to climate change, biodiversity loss is expected to become more severe. And climate change is already harming the planet and all its inhabitants more quickly than we can adapt. On the other hand, healthy ecosystems help to regulate the climate by sequestering carbon, which makes biodiversity protection the foundation of effective climate action. And of course, climate change and biodiversity loss aren't just connected with each other. They also intersect with pollution, colonialism, debt, financing, and the current global economic model, powered by fossil fuels, exploiting the planet and people, and creating inequity. So these vast webs of interconnection urge us to look deeper, to examine the workings of the systems that are shaping our world, so that we can see possibilities for creating change. And I would suggest that this is at heart both a spiritual and an ethical task, because in the end, what we need is a new relationship between humanity, Earth, and all Earth's inhabitants. The implications of our interconnection are spiritual in that we are being summoned to understand ourselves more fully as co-members of creation, and to see how St. Paul's assertion that in Christ we live and move and have our being is true for all creation members. We are all part of one complex, interacting whole. We are one body. And the implications are ethical because this interconnected body needs to be protected and nurtured. Indeed, the ethical stakes are growing because we've seen that human choices and actions now have planetary-wide impacts. And this takes me to the second lens, the drivers or root causes of climate change and biodiversity loss. One message I kept hearing from civil society groups at COP15 was a call to address these drivers of ecological damage. It reminded me of this quote from Laudato Si: "Get to the roots of the present situation so as to consider not only its symptoms, but also its deepest causes." And integral ecology, that concept at the core of Laudato Si, is all about drawing our attention to the interconnected and interacting drivers of ecological and social harms. It's about changing the systems that are shaping how we relate to Earth and each other. This focus on systemic change matters because decades of incremental efforts on climate action and biodiversity protection have had little impact against the planetary threats that flow from our current economic and political models. Vested interests and short-term interests too often prevail. The depth and scope of the systemic change must reflect the transformation that's called for in Laudato Si, a transformation rooted in both consciousness raising and action. At the end of COP15, Pierre du Plessis, the representative from Namibia, spoke truth in a way that awakened consciousness. He illustrated how the words we use can either take us to the heart of the matter or they can obscure what's really going on. Words can raise our consciousness and move us to action, or they can divert our attention and lull us into inaction. He pointed to the language of developed countries and developing countries, noting that such language tries to hide the way that economic, financial, and political systems are creating disparity, resulting in great wealth for some and great poverty for others, while also doing great harm to the climate and the planet's biodiversity. Such awareness raising is meant to move us to action, to move us to political advocacy aimed at the kind of policy changes that are necessary if we are to transform the systems that are harming both people and planet. But this political advocacy can't rely on a few people. It needs ever-widening circles of political engagement. And certainly this widespread political engagement is one of the goals of Laudato Si. Like du Plessis at COP15, I believe the speakers we have today can also awaken new levels of consciousness in us. Our task will be to move ourselves to new levels of political advocacy. And so to summarize, I've been highlighting two lenses, interconnection and transformation, and emphasizing the importance of both consciousness raising and action, especially political advocacy, if we want to be part of creating the change that was called for, not only at COP27 and COP15, but also in Laudato Si. So I'm going to stop here and I'll turn things back over to Joe.
Thank you so much, Sue. As always, Sue really helps us to focus on what we want to do, what we need to do. And I think you'll find that the agenda set up for today will lead us in a very good journey to get exactly to where Sue was talking about, how we can raise our own consciousness by listening to wonderful speakers and then move to some action together. That's the point of the day. So thank you very much. I'll briefly say that the agenda will be such that I'll introduce and then we'll listen to two wonderful speakers. We're very pleased to have them here. We'll entertain some questions when they're finished that Varka will be looking at in the chat. So if you have a question, you can write it into the chat eventually after you hear our speakers. We're then going to have an intervention to try and elucidate, show us the calls to action that are possible for everyone to take forward. And then please stay on this Zoom meeting until the end, because we will have a little survey that all of you can fill in very, very quickly, trying to give the organizers of Joint Ecological Ministries a bit of an idea of where you would like to move next, what would help your work in integral ecology move towards next. And I think we'll continue with this this kind of two-pronged idea that Sue laid out so very clearly, raising consciousness and then action that's needed. I look forward to next week, for example, people like Sue and Geneviève Galland from the Office of Religious Congregations for Ecological Integral Ecology will be on the Hill in meetings with MPs and some lobby days that are happening there. So there's lots of things that we will be able to move forward on. Allow me to quickly introduce and adequately introduce our two speakers who will have something over 20 minutes each. These two wonderful speakers were chosen by Joint Ecological Ministries because they're both advocating actions that have come out of this context of the last year and the two COPs that Sue has referred to. So allow me to begin by introducing our first speaker, who is Tzeporah Berman. Tzeporah has been designing and winning environmental campaigns in Canada and internationally for a long while. I remember having some things for us set up on the wall in the NGO I used to work with. She's currently the International Program Director at Stand Earth, a group that I get information from quite regularly. She's chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Committee, which we're going to hear more about. She's co-founder of a global gas and oil network. And in 2021, she gave a widely viewed TED Talk that you can look up when Tzeporah presented the case for a global treaty to phase out fossil fuels. So Tzeporah's speaking to us from Vancouver today before she heads on to other places tomorrow. We're glad to have you with us, Tzeporah. And allow me to introduce Louise as well, our second speaker, Louise Romain. She's an anthropologist. She's a campaigner for climate justice and Indigenous rights, working with a group called Stop Ecocide, which is a global movement that wants to create legal protection for life on Earth by including ecocide as a crime against peace under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So Louise is joining us from close to London in England there. But last year, she traveled throughout Canada to connect with the lands, the waterways, and the peoples that are affected in this country by fossil fuels, logging, and mining industries. Louise is also producer of a podcast with the sounds and stories she harvested on that trip, and it's called The Circle of Voices. So we're going to have a wonderful possibility to listen to both Tzeporah and then Louise in each of the next 20 minutes. So Tzeporah, over to you. Thank you for putting in the chat already your TED Talk so that people can look it up. Over to you, Tzeporah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you all. That was the calmest and nicest part of my day. Your opening, that was really beautiful, and I feel much more centered than I had after 5 hours of Zoom meetings. I wanted to start Well, first of all, by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam First Nations here in Vancouver, Canada, where I'm privileged to live and work. And I thought I would start I'm going to share my screen and give you a bit of an overview of some of the logic behind what I'm working on right now, the Fossil Fuel Treaty, and why it has, I think, fairly significant growing support from the faith community, and where we're going with the treaty next. Just going to check and make sure that you can see that one slide. Great. I did an entire presentation the other day where it turned out they were looking at my working screen, which was terribly embarrassing, but no one was willing to tell me, so I thought I would just check. I think in these conversations, it's always important to start first with some of the basics. Where are we today? I think probably everyone on this call already knows that we are facing a significant climate emergency. I think sometimes, though, it's a fascinating thing with our own human psychology that even if we can know what's happening, because there's such a disconnect with how serious and big it is, we can turn away from it just in order to live our everyday life. And I talk about in my writing right now that it's like staring into the sun, that we have to continue to do it, to remind ourselves, to have the conversations in order to be a part of ensuring that we see solutions. So I always like to start with a reminder about where we are and why we do this work. So, you know, I expect I don't have to say here that we are currently very off track in trying to reduce the amount of pollution that's trapped in our atmosphere that is literally blanketing the earth and now kind of smothering the earth. I think there are important debates to be had on how we address this and the equity between countries and many of the issues already addressed today. But what's not open for debate is the pure physics of it. That carbon and other greenhouse gases are being trapped in our atmosphere, and they're causing the dramatic increase in extreme weather that we're experiencing today, that we have seen a significant increase in global temperature rise as a result. And that's a direct result of the increase of use of carbon and fossil fuels in our lifetimes. And I think that's an important thing to think about too, that, you know, 70% of the, if not more, of the pollution that's currently trapped in our atmosphere has happened in my lifetime. So it's really in this generation's moment that we're seeing this change. So where are we today in dealing with it? We've talked now about the two Conference of Parties. We have policies in place right now that would lead the planet to about somewhere between a 2 to 3 degree warming. So far on the planet, we've experienced about a 1.1 degree warming, and we've all seen the impacts that is having. Last year, 33 million people alone displaced without homes in Pakistan alone, just from the floods. And of course, that's really just the tip of the iceberg. But a 3 degree warming in most analysis leaves significant parts of the planet completely uninhabitable. It's a hard thing to wrap our heads around what that actually means. But I think for me, one of the best analysis that I've ever seen comes from David Wallace Wells in his book, The Uninhabitable Earth, where he summarized the science of what we would see at a 2 degree world. And he said, as temperatures rise, this could mean that many of the biggest cities in the Middle East and South Asia would become lethally hot in the summer at 2 degrees. That will happen as soon as 2050. There would be ice-free summers in the Arctic and the unstoppable disintegration of the West Antarctic's ice sheet, which some scientists believe has already begun, threatening the world's coastal cities with inundation. Coral reefs will mostly disappear, and there will be tens of millions of climate refugees. I actually think, looking at what we've experienced in the last year, that he was vastly underestimating the amount of climate refugees. And of course, we're now seeing reports out of the UN suggesting that we're already in the hundreds of millions right now. So we've seen the floods, we've seen the fires, we're seeing the droughts, and also, of course, the ocean acidification. Our oceans today are 30% more acidified than they were when my son was born, one of my sons 20 years ago, leading people like Al Gore in his most recent talk last week to say that we are literally boiling the oceans. So why is this happening? Climate policy and climate negotiations are incredibly complicated, but what's not complicated and what we have in some ways overlooked in the conversation is that 86% of the emissions that are trapped in our atmosphere today come from three products, three things: oil, gas, and coal. Strangely, when I started working internationally to try and understand what limits we have on the development of more fossil fuels, because as some of you may know, I spent 10 years working on oil sands issues, including both running pipeline campaigns and organizing campaigns in Canada, but also being appointed by various levels of government to try and draft climate regulations for the oil sands. And what I found in that work is that our governments don't believe they're responsible for limiting the production of fossil fuels or constraining them as a climate issue. They believe that they're only responsible for the emissions, so the pollution, and even that we're off track. But what we know today is that we continue to build out more oil, gas, and coal, even though we have more than enough on the surface of the planet are already under construction. And I really wanted to understand what our current agreements do to constrain the production of these three products. It was a shock to me, and I expect to some of you, to find out that the Paris Agreement doesn't even include the words fossil fuels or oil or gas or coal. The fossil fuel industry has been quite successful in international negotiations in making themselves invisible and making the issue of emissions reductions and targets so complicated that the simple fact that we need to constrain the production and use of these three products as a primary means to save lives today has gone undebated for most of the 30 years that we have been trying to address the climate crisis. So I worked with a number of others at Stockholm Environment Institute and the United Nations years ago to produce the first ever production gap report. We have an emissions gap report that's been produced every year for over a decade, but we hadn't been looking at how much are we producing, and is what we're producing consistent with our goals in the Paris Agreement or climate safety? It turns out that we're currently on track to produce about 110%, or double the amount of fossil fuels that is consistent with 1.5 degrees. So what does that really mean? It means that between now and 2030, companies and our governments plan to produce double the amount of fossil fuels than we can ever use or ever burn on the surface of the planet, or it will burn us. So we already have enough coal, gas, and oil in existing projects that if it were all burned, to take us well past 1.5 degrees. So why is that important? It's important because at this critical moment in history, we're spending the majority of our political capital, our financial capital, literally $930 billion in the next, between now and 2030, planned to be spent on new fossil fuel projects for a product that we know is actually literally killing us at this point, not just because of climate change, but because air pollution from fossil fuels is the leading cause of death worldwide, the leading cause of premature death worldwide. 1 in 8 people worldwide died just from the air pollution from fossil fuels, let alone when we add the deaths as a result of the heat waves and the floods, etc. So we're right now, we're spending literally a lot of our financial and our political capital to dig up more fossil fuels. And that's become the focus of my work and the focus of the new global movement for the fossil fuel treaty. So without any agreements on fossil fuel productions, it makes the transition harder. It risks creating stranded assets and financial turmoil. It increases the risks to workers and communities. It delays renewable energy expansion. Many of you probably know that already renewables are cheaper at scale than fossil fuels, but governments are still subsidizing fossil fuels. And the fossil fuel companies are still building more and more instead of building renewable infrastructure because they're making record profits, billions of dollars of profits on fossil fuels. So it delays economic diversification and it locks in both political power, but also physical infrastructure. When you build a pipeline, you don't build a pipeline for 5 years. You build a pipeline thinking it will exist for 30 to 40 years. So the infrastructure that we build today will drive the world tomorrow. And so building more fossil fuel infrastructure at this moment in history affects what kind of world we're going to live in tomorrow. And it's for all of those reasons and looking at the science that now the International Energy Agency in its net zero pathway says there's no need for new investment in fossil fuel supply. It's why the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a report that was signed off on by 150 governments from around the world, including my own, Canada, has said that the report must, the UN Secretary General, when he released the IPCC, said that this report must sound a death knell for coal and fossil fuels before they destroy the planet. In fact, both the IEA and the IPCC reports say very clearly that we cannot have any new projects or new expansion of fossil fuels. That means not in the oil sands, not off the east coast of Canada, where the government has just approved new oil drilling, no new LNG or fracking, and not just in Canada, but of course, all over the world. The UN Secretary General went on to say that investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure is moral and economic madness. I was talking to economists and scientists earlier today who are crunching the numbers to try and identify now how many lives per ton of carbon that we release at this moment, how many lives are equated to a barrel of oil. Because with the rising death toll, both from climate change as well as from air pollution, we can now calculate that, which is both terrifying and useful. But it is really for this conversation, I think, which makes us all have to face that climate changes and biodiversity loss is no longer an environmental issue. These are human rights issues. These are the moral challenge of our age. The idea of a fossil fuel treaty actually came years ago from Pacific Island nations who created a declaration called the Suva Declaration on Climate Change. We've seen so much leadership from Pacific Island nations who face some of the worst impacts of climate change. They are the reason we have a 1.5 degree goal, which will save lives instead of a 2 degree goal in the Paris Agreement. They brought us the concept of loss and damage. And in 2015, created the Suva Declaration, calling for a moratorium on the expansion of fossil fuel extracting industries. I won an award 3 years ago called the Climate Breakthrough Award, which is given to a couple of people every year, and we're given $2 million to try risky new strategies to address global climate change. I decided to use the funds to create the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative and started hiring diplomats and experts and campaign experts from around the world to help develop it and design it. And the reason I did that is because of this gap in global policy, but also in domestic policy, where we don't have a norm that addressing fossil fuel expansion is part of climate policy, and where we really need to shift and challenge the influence of the fossil fuel industry. We have so many brilliant climate campaigns from around the world, and especially the leadership of frontline communities and indigenous leadership trying to stop specific projects. But we need to be greater than the sum of our parts. The time frame that we're working with is short. We need to bend the curve of both emissions and production. So to ensure absolute decline of both pollution and the production of fossil fuels within the next couple of years. And every moment that we waste costs us. And so I really was thinking about, how do we become greater than the sum of our parts? How do we knit together all of these disparate initiatives and people who are concerned about climate change and create a bold new demand to governments to act quickly? We also really wanted to focus on the need for international cooperation. We hear a lot today about the need for a just transition and for countries to transition away from fossil fuels. But because of the structure of our economic systems, because of the history of colonialization, we have massive inequalities in the system. Many of the countries I work with and work in, like Ecuador, they simply couldn't stop oil drilling even if they want to, because they're drilling for oil just to feed their debt to China. So there's these financial structural issues, and some countries are more vulnerable than other countries. It's going to be more difficult for some countries to transition than it is for others. I think this chart helps demonstrate that challenge. There's no doubt that all fossil fuel producing countries face major challenges. But if you look at countries like the US or Canada or the UK on the left of the chart, not only do they have much more diversified economies, so we're not dependent on oil revenues for taxation and provision of government services, as well as a higher GDP per capita, which indicates a greater capacity to transition. And then by contrast, you look at other countries who are just so far more dependent on government revenue, and they have a lower capacity for transition. We're going to need international cooperation to ensure a global just transition. So the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty has three basic pillars or premises. The first is non-proliferation, to stop expanding the problem. Second is an equitable phase out. Who gets to produce and how much in this moment of time? We're not saying we can turn the taps off overnight, but if we stop expanding new fossil fuel production and wind down existing fields, how fast is that wind down? Right now, the market decides who gets to produce what fossil fuels and how much, because we don't have international cooperation on that. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to leave the fate of humanity up to the marketplace. And the third pillar is a just transition, to accelerate an equitable transition. And so we're looking at mechanisms for international cooperation and treaty language in all of those areas. We've studied many other treaties globally that have been able to achieve significant change in quite a small period of time. Many of the treaties we studied, by the point that a country proposed the treaty on the floor of the UN, it was only 2 years before real negotiating began. In each one of these cases, convening, cities supporting, states supporting, civil society engaging, the public momentum and campaign was essential to achieving that treaty. And that's why we've designed the treaty campaign around as a directed network campaign. So what that really means is that we're working with organizations from around the world and asking them to make it their own. And the Secretariat will provide resources and information. Our goals are to change the global norm on fossil fuels, to motivate cities and states, to increase transparency on accountability on who's producing what and how much, and to grow the global movement for a just energy transition. And as I mentioned, provide the missing framework. So we are structured as a directed network campaign with a campaign and communications team, a cities team, research, and then diplomatic engagement. And so far, in our 2.5 years of being live, we now have 1,800 civil society organizations from 105 countries who have endorsed, and many of those organizations now running their own campaigns for the Fossil Fuel Treaty. We've had 101 Nobel laureates, including the Dalai Lama, endorse the Fossil Fuel Treaty and call on the UN to start the negotiations. Close to 3,000 academics and scientists have now endorsed the principles of the treaty and the call for the treaty, and cities from around the world, 80 cities now, some of the largest cities in the world, have passed motions at city councils and calling for the endorsement of the treaty. Most recently, health organizations and even the World Health Organization, a UN body, has joined the call for the treaty. The European Parliament right before COP27. And in last September, Vanuatu became the first nation state to call for the fossil fuel treaty at the UN General Assembly, joined by Tuvalu at COP27 at the UNFCCC. There are about 550 elected officials from around the world from 77 countries who have endorsed independently via the parliamentaries' call for fossil fuel treaty. And also youth activists from around the world. And I want to end just by a little brief on what faith groups are doing. Obviously, for you and for faith leaders and faith groups from around the world, the fact that the science surrounding the most urgent danger facing humanity is undeniable is critical. We all want to be good caretakers of our common home. And so faith institutions from around the world, many who have been working on divestment, are now running campaigns on the fossil fuel treaty. A Vatican cardinal has endorsed the fossil fuel treaty. We have had faith organizations from all over the world organizing events around the treaty. We now have institutions representing 1.5 billion people who have endorsed the fossil fuel treaty. And these faith organizations are organizing around a letter and a petition, which I'll end with. But just some details for those of you who are doing organizing. I'm just trying to get this little thing away so I can read this. The Parliament of the World's Religions, PWR, is the world's largest interfaith gathering with about 6,000 to 9,000 attendees. Our partner Green Faith has secured a commitment from PWR to make the treaty a major focal point of the July 2023 convening. So we plan to focus there in our faith outreach with petition sign-ons and statements from the PWR for media, interviews with religious leaders, etc. And then there's also other work that's going on around the world through LADA-C trainings in Latin America, and Green Faith is working with Japanese organizations for the G7. And I'll put this link in the chat, but this is where as individuals or as institutions, as faith leaders, you can join the call for the treaty. And I hope you will, because this is, I believe, one of the most important issues of our age. And we need to quickly be able to build power. The fossil fuel industry is a concentrated power. Civil society movements are disparate. We're based in our communities, in our homes, in our institutions, in our churches. We're a more decentralized power. Together, I think we can be greater than the sum of our parts. And we can urge our governments to actually stand up to the fossil fuel industry and ensure that we stop expanding the problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Tzeporah. Terrific energy, terrific input, lots of information, and I'm sure lots for people to consider. Without further ado, could we have Louise address the group too, please?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity to share about Ecocide and Stop Ecocide movements. And yeah, massive thank you to Tzeporah for your leadership and your ongoing commitment to fight for a better world our hearts know is possible. Making ecocide a crime is an idea whose time is due. It was first coined by the Professor Arthur W. Galston. This US biologist was part of a team of scientists in 1970 who helped prepare a chemical component for the defoliant Agent Orange. He spoke at the Conference on War and National Responsibility in Washington about the use of Agent Orange in the Vietnam War. The chemical herbicide was being sprayed by the US military forces over the South Vietnamese forests for the dual purpose of defoliating forest areas that might conceal Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces, but also to destroy crops that might feed the enemy. So just like genocide denounces the willful destruction of specific groups of human beings, Galston used the word ecocide to characterize the willful mass damage and destruction of the Vietnamese jungle. 2 years later, in 1972, the word ecocide appears again, but this time on a global stage. In his opening speech at the United Nations Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment, Prime Minister of Sweden, Olof Palme, calls the Vietnam War an outrage, sometimes referred to as ecocide. Now, fast forward to 2019, when Pope Francis spoke at the 20th International Congress of Penal Law that was held at the Vatican. There, he invited the audience to consider ecocide as the 5th category of crimes against peace. He recalled the proposition by the Synod on the Pan-Amazon region to define, I quote, ecological sin as an action and omission against God, against the neighbor, the community, and the environment. Ecological sin is a sin against future generations and manifests itself in acts and habits of pollution and destruction of the harmony of the environment, transgression against the principles of interdependence, and the breaking of solidarity networks between creatures. The Pope further described acts that can be considered as ecocide as the massive contamination of air, land, and water resources, the large-scale destruction of flora and fauna, and any action capable of producing an ecological disaster or destroying an ecosystem. He said that by ecocide, we should understand the loss, damage, and destruction of ecosystems of a given territory, so that its enjoyment by the inhabitants has been or may be severely affected. This is a 5th category of crimes against peace, which should be recognized as such by the international community. What does ecocide mean, actually? So the etymological meaning comes from oikos, which in Greek is house or home, and sidere in Latin, which means to kill. So it literally means the killing of our home. And the idea to create a campaign and a movement around the need to criminalize ecocide started as a seed in the mind, heart, and soul of a woman called Polly Higgins. She was a Scottish barrister and visionary, which you might find online called the Earth Lawyer. And she felt called one day to grapple with the question, how do we create a legal duty of care for the Earth? She then set out on a quest for the rest of her life to develop a solid legal framework to protect the natural world and all living beings. And I'd like to read a few quotes from Polly from this book, Dare to be Great. I choose to put my energies into my vision of a better world for the whole of the wider Earth community. Earth is a living being. She gives us life, and we have a reciprocal role to give life back. Ecocide is both a personal and a collective harm. Yet the greatness lies in each of us to take up the mantle and become voices for the Earth. Resetting the collective moral compass today is proving a great challenge, but it is resetting. More and more people are hearing the call, a call that is coming directly from the Earth and taking action in nations across the world. More and more people are discovering their ability to respond. For some, it is a matter of life or death. Such action takes greatness, and every time we take action, speak out, and shine a light on where there is harm, we reset our own inner compass and pave the way for others coming behind us. Sometimes a law comes along that has the potential to change our frame of reference altogether. A touchstone that serves as a reminder of what it is we most value: harm or harmony, war or peace, profit or people and planet, the scarcity of life or the sacredness of life, lack or love. The former feeds an uncontrollable sense of fear, while the latter is born of a sense of a duty of care. And the Stop Ecocide campaign is her legacy. Stop Ecocide is a global campaign on its way to make the most severe and widespread destruction of ecosystems an international crime. There are currently 4 types of international crimes: genocide, as I named earlier, crimes of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. So as you can probably guess, all of these are anthropocentric. They all relate to human societies and peoples. And none of them deal with our planet, the environment, and biodiversity. So the goal of Stop Ecocide International is to amend the Rome Statute, which is one of the most powerful legal documents in the world. The Rome Statute is intended to address the most serious crimes of concern to the international community as a whole, those acts which most threaten the peace, security, and well-being of the world. I believe we can all agree that mass damage and destruction of vital ecosystems through human activity now constitutes precisely such a threat on a global scale. Ecocide not only has devastating and direct consequences for communities and nations now, but also extreme implications for the future of human civilization as a whole, and for the wider community of species with whom we share our planetary home. So the goal for Stop Ecocide is to amend this document, the Rome Statute, which governs the International Criminal Court, to add ecocide as an international crime. This is the only global mechanism that directly accesses the criminal justice system of 123 nations. So it's basically a key missing piece that can be implemented within existing legal systems and that would create long-term legal protection for all life on Earth. And unlike agreements or civil lawsuits, making ecocide a crime would create personal, individual criminal responsibility for key decision makers. It would adjust the ground rules to temper corporate behavior and prevent finance from flowing to practices that destroy ecosystems to a harmonious relationship. And most importantly, it would make serious harm to nature legally and morally unacceptable. Ecocide law has the power to shift cultural assumptions and our understanding of our place in and our responsibility towards the natural world. It can also encourage governments and businesses to take environmental law and due diligence seriously, and in this way to ensure the Earth's most precious ecosystems can be protected and allowed to recover. Since Polly Higgins passed away in 2019, an incredible movement has sprung up. Stop Ecocide is now active in 45 countries, and it keeps growing. And it has developed various initiatives such as ocean, farmers, artists, or youth for ecocide law. And in over 25 countries, ecocide has been discussed at governmental or parliamentary level. It has also been repeatedly featured in international conferences of the United Nations, like the COP27 and the COP15 mentioned earlier. But most significantly for the campaign, it has been a strong topic at the Assembly of State Parties, which is the annual gathering of the International Criminal Court. So it is becoming an idea whose time has come. Now I would like to bring it home and tell you about the work of the national team, Stop Ecocide Canada. The Canadian campaign to criminalize ecocide has been active for the past 2 years. From a concept barely known and spoken of in Canada, they have brought visibility and awareness to this essential missing piece of legislation, and most importantly, the need to make it a crime. The team has been proactive, resourceful, and resilient. They met with parliamentarians, senators, and government officers across the country. They started a youth petition and opened a local chapter in Toronto. They received media coverage in various publications, and they established partnerships with prominent Canadian and Indigenous leaders, lawyers, activists, and youth. By collecting hundreds of signatures, the demands of Stop Ecocide Canada have been raised in Parliament by various MPs, either from the Liberal, the Greens, the NDP, or the Conservative parties. And last winter in Ottawa, They held their first press conference and a very well-attended diplomatic event. So the small team of volunteers has been doing tremendous work to bring the topic of ecocide into Canadian political spaces and civil society. But there is a lot more to go. And so in order to sustain their advocacy, they are currently looking for financial support to raise awareness of criminalizing ecocide by organizing high-level diplomatic events in Ottawa, educating younger generations, and lobby politicians across party line. And I would like to share here a few call to action. I'll pop the links after the end of my chat. The first thing you can do to stay in touch is very simple, join the mailing list. Your donations will be very welcome to the team as well. And if you're interested to step up and lobby your representative, either as an individual or as a network, I'll pop in an email address that you can contact, and the Canadian team will provide training and resources for that. But now I'd like to focus on an initiative that I think is more relevant for you all, and that's Faith for Ecocide Law. Faith for Ecocide Law is an inter-religious coalition gathering religious and spiritual leaders and voices to express support for an international crime of ecocide. Again, bringing some quotes from this book that was released at COP27 in Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh. And the Faith for Ecocide Law released a manifesto. And yeah, I will just be reading a few parts from there. As humans, we have the ability to contemplate who we are and what we experience. The ecological crisis is an existential crisis, a crisis of understanding our place in the world. For thousands of years, faith traditions have provided humanity with narratives to understand who we are. As people of faith, we embrace a worldview that includes those who came before us and those who will come after. Laws and regulations are built on ethical presumptions about what is good and bad. Faith traditions often provide the wells from which these values are coming. Values for the protection of the vulnerable are found in many traditions. And now our home, Mother Earth, is in need of protection too. When we allow the destruction of the biosphere we all share, it is the world's poor people and future generations who will suffer most. So as people of faith from all around the world, we demand a global response to prevent ecocide. To live in peace with each other, we must live in peace with the earth. The rules of our societies are laws, and we can change them to protect what is precious. In the Anthropocene, we need a duty of care, law at the very highest level to protect the earth. We need ecocide to become a crime against peace at the International Criminal Court, among the other crimes of concern to the whole international community. The world is a living, sacred whole, not just a resource open to exploitation. In a global economy, we need global rules to protect the sacred. Over billions of years, life has evolved on the beautiful planet we inhabit. As humanity, we share this planet with each other and all other living beings. It is our only home. Today, when humanity is behind the steering wheel of the future, we need a shift towards a global understanding of respect and reverence for Mother Earth, all the creation. We need a law to support such a shift. As people of faith from all around the world, we call on our leaders to create a duty of care by amending the Rome Statute to make ecocide an international crime. I really recommend getting this book. It's quite small, and I will be reading just a few more. This one is from the Hindu perspective, titled From a Greed Culture to a Green Culture. As religious leaders and faith communities, we must be the change and also bring the change. We must bring the light in this time of darkness and be the light. Faith leaders can play a very important role in reversing climate change and ensuring sustainable development. We must inspire our congregations and our communities to be the solution because the time to act is now. The future is in our hands, and it depends on how we live in the present. And this is from the Jewish perspective by Rabbi Yonatan Lerel, titled Caring for Creation is Key to Receiving the Blessings of the Creator. He quotes Dr. Gus Beth from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Dr. Gus Beth says, I used to think that top global environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address the problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. Scientific research has powerfully revealed the widespread degradation of nature. Yet, scientists' ability to motivate society toward ecological change is limited. Religious belief and understanding have the potential to move many more people worldwide to environmental action in a way that the science hasn't been able to do. Last June, marked the 50th anniversary of the Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment. So 50 years after that speech of Olof Palme and the very first use of ecocide on the global stage. And that conference was called Stockholm Plus 50. Some of you might have heard about that. And a statement was issued during that week by the UNEP, which stands for United Nations Environment Programme, their Faith for Earth initiative, where nearly 200 faith leaders and representatives of world religions called for the criminalization of ecocide. So it's definitely an initiative that is growing and gaining support. Lastly, I'd like to share an insight from the Christian perspective, transforming the world into the dream of God. To be a follower of Christ includes being humble, being driven by humility in the relationships within which we are all living. It is interesting to discover that climate science often talks about humility as the unconditional quality humans need to strive for. That means real humility, engendered by the realization that we are all part of the same web of life on this planet, and that we are all dependent upon one another. Not the kind of humility which is a self-promoting image of politicians and business people when they are in trouble. We are now so close to the tipping points of many life-sustaining ecosystems. We need simplicity. We need a new economic global world order that gives room for simplicity, welcomes simplicity, and serves the needs of all that exists. For this transformation, we need cooperation. To save the planet is not an isolated Christian business. It is a challenge for all humankind, and it can be solved only in cooperation. The issue here is how we, as Christians and churches, can contribute to this transformation through our faith, theology, and experience. So again, here I would like to share there's a few concrete actions. I'm guessing the link has been put in the chat because I see the messages popping, but you can join the International Faith for Ecocide Law Network online. And then there is an idea also to create a Canadian network of Faith for Ecocide Law. Again, I'll be putting the email in the chat, and you will be guided to people in the team who could help you do that. But that's kind of more an invitation and an offer for anyone here who might be keen to do that. To end, I would like to invite you to tap into imagination. At the heart of the pandemic, I came across moral imaginations, which is a collective imagining to increase radical kinship with the human and the more than human worlds, present, past, and future. Their approach to imagining is based around three core pillars: future unborn generations, where the idea is to shift our perspective from the current day to the future and looking back on these moments from 7 generations in the future. The second pillar is the more than human world, The idea that everybody can reclaim their capabilities to speak on behalf of nature, and that our connection with the natural world will help us fight to protect it. And lastly, ancestors. The idea that by expanding our sense of time and connecting with a sense of the deep time, we change our perspectives and detach from the sense of urgency of the everyday. And I think, especially in our current times, where often looking at the news, we kind of get bombarded by, all of the reminder of the climate crisis and ecological extinction and the wider collapse that is also unfolding potentially in our economic and political systems. So I think there is a lot of strength and beauty to be found in this radical dreaming and this visioning work in our current times. And I'd like to bring another quote from Polly there. We can be raging bitter, fighting against injustice, or we can come from a place of deep care, seeking restorative justice and a better way of preventing future harm. Ours can be a vision of a world where we have entered the era of ecocide, a world where we harness the power of the sun, water, and air to provide the alternative to conventional fossil fuels, a world where we no longer cause significant harm to the air, culturally and ecologically, a world where we are protectors, not protesters, speaking from a place of care and upholding a system of decision-making where a first do no harm principle is paramount. And I believe this really connects with the work of the Catholic priest, cultural historian, and scholar Thomas Berry, who knew about our responsibility as humans to become a mutually enhancing presence for the Earth system and societies. Today, as many other Fridays, but especially on March 3rd, there was a massive strike by Fridays for Future, so thousands of young people have taken the streets again. And so today, I dare you to imagine what a world without ecocide would look like and what role you might have in this great work. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Louise. It's lovely that you're not only quoting Thomas Berry, which probably everybody on this call has read, but that quote from Gus Speth always rings true with people as well. So well done. So we've had really good presentations. We have a few minutes for questions that are left, and I'm going to mention two things that have come in the chat, and I'll ask Tzeporah and then you, Louise, to maybe just make a few comments on these 2 points, if you would. So I'll propose two issues. One is the question of divestment and how that might, divestment especially by Roman Catholic congregations, communities, how that might help. This question was put forward by Agnes, who has worked with the Laudato Si movement here in Canada, which has produced an accelerator tool which allows groups like ours to move towards divestment. So how could the divestment campaign help in each of those? And then there's a question from Paul, kind of answered by Tzeporah in the chat, but maybe a few comments on the business of the consumption side of fossil fuels. Of course, has been, we're moving to green vehicles, which will also mean huge mining campaigns, especially in places like Northern Ontario, Quebec, other places. And maybe the resurgence of nuclear power, which are perhaps not so ecologically correct either. So a comment there as well. So briefly, if you might, while other people are putting questions into the chat, you might want to both make a comment in those. We'll start with Tzeporah.
Thank you. I was actually just putting another scientific paper in the chat for people who are interested on the risks and the trade-offs around renewable energy and battery storage. It is a really important conversation because as we build a future that we want and that has less devastating impacts, we want to make sure that we're not, out of the pan and into the fire, so to speak. Nothing that we do as humans on the surface of the planet is going to have no impact. And it is very clear, I think, that the dependence on fossil fuels is going to have a far greater impact than the mining for the greener solutions. And there's lots of studies that evaluate that, and I put a couple of them in the chat. But as I mentioned in my talk, I mean, one issue is the air pollution from fossil fuels. The other is the enormous impacts from water pollution. We're hearing a lot of that the last couple of days in Canada because of the 9 months of toxic leakage from the Imperial oil sands tailings mines that have been poisoning the people downstream, especially the Athabasca Chipewyan. And the government in Imperial Oil didn't even tell the Athabasca Chipewyan for 9 months that there's been a breach of that tailings pond, and that's been big news in Canada. I don't know if people really understand the scale of the fossil fuel industry's impact on the planet, but just in Canada alone, we now have 1 trillion liters of toxic sludge in open, unlined pits. That's just one of the major fossil fuel developments around the world. So when you actually put the impacts side by side, the impacts of the fossil fuel industry and fossil fuel combustion and infrastructure are far greater. And that's in part because while there's an impact to building a solar panel and building an electric car, there isn't the constant need for more and more mining and drilling over the lifetime in order to keep it running. And that's just the basics of what you're dealing with. There's no it's just you know, I recently found sometimes we remember things by stories, and I recently heard that part of the opposition to actually moving to electric cars earlier has been the car companies, not the car companies, but the auto dealerships lobbying against zero emission vehicle policies for years. And you think, why? They could sell an electric car, they could sell a fossil fuel car. It turns out that electric cars just don't need to be fixed. Because there's no grinding and combustion, electric cars have far less costs over their lifetime to the owner, because you don't need to fix them as often. And that's how the retail outlets make their money. It's not on selling the cars, it's on fixing the cars, which is why they like combustion cars better. And I just thought that was really, you know, interesting. The impact of electric cars and renewables, it is going to be far less, but we do need to have better land use planning and human rights and indigenous rights policies in place to make sure that we're not, and biodiversity policies to make sure that we're not doing even far greater damage as a result of that mining and the development of those materials.
Thanks. Comment from Louise, perhaps?
Sure, I'm happy to add something. As you mentioned, divestment. I guess the way I see it is that there is a whole spectrum of actions and possibilities that people can take, and some of them are very individual and some of them are very collective. And divestment is something that everyone can do, just to be responsible and conscious about where your money is. And at the same time, it has a limited span of action as well. So some fossil fuel projects are, for example, just funded by national banks, and then whatever kind of opposition we may have as people and wanting to support financial systems who are more harmonious, then that's kind of like counterproductive in a way. But at the same time, I think there is this like deep questioning that we're going to have to face living in the Western world, of like how much we rely on fossil fuels, how much we rely on ecocide, how our lifestyle is really intertwined with all of these, and then thinking about the fact that we are profiting from it, but in other parts of the world, the global south and many indigenous communities in the global north, they are bearing the brunt of this. So I feel that there is often this kind of like shaming and guilt narratives that come up when we do think about those dynamics. But the way I want to think about it is like, how can I be conscious of my consumption and all of this while still being in solidarity with people who are even more impacted by this?
Thank you. Thank you for your comment. I think we have time for one last question. Tzeporah, I'm going to ask you to answer it. Some of us who work in larger contexts beyond, say, a religious community where there aren't too many oil and gas workers, but in church communities where you have membership that are dependent on the on this huge reach of this multi-billion-dollar industry in Canada, which is earning money hand over fist right now. How are there groups that are able to sign on? Have there been? I'm on the group of the Green Economy Network. They haven't signed on. Are there unions that are getting on board, and how are you addressing those issues that always come up about people that are going to be affected by our decision to try and end the great expansion of fossil fuels?
Thanks, Joe. If you go to our website under and just look at who is endorsed, you can see civil society groups. You can see so you can see exactly who's endorsed, and you can look at it by country. So you could check on the Canadian institutions. But I want to just we are and have been working with unions and union organizations from the beginning of designing the treaty, mostly at an international level, but some of the groups who are now campaigning on treaty around the world in different countries are starting to work with unions in their countries. There have been endorsements from many unions already to the treaty. And here's why. Because what we're calling for is a plan. If we don't have a plan for aligning the production of fossil fuels with our climate goals, we have a complete disconnect between what we're trying to do on emissions reduction and phasing out fossil fuels and the growth of fossil fuel production. And so numerous studies and analysis, including the government's own, have said that at some point, production is going to have to go down, and production will have to go down likely very quickly in order to meet our goals. And if we continue to do build out, you end up with stranded assets. You end up with what we've had so far in Canada, which is boom and bust industries. It's going, it's not, it's going, it's not. People have jobs, people don't have jobs. So what the fossil fuel treaty is calling for is a plan. Is a just transition plan that leaves no worker or family behind. And to have an honest plan, you don't just need to look at emissions reductions and coal plants shutting down. You actually need to look at what will production levels be over time if we're trying to meet these goals. And our country hasn't done that. In fact, most countries around the world haven't done that. And so if you don't have those production level numbers, you can't have those job level numbers, and you can't create a proper plan. And so we dedicate an enormous amount of our resources at the Secretariat to looking at issues of just transition and meeting with and working with unions and trying to create just transition conversations in regions or countries where the government's willing to do that. We're participating, for example, in the Just Transition Coalition that just emerged with the government in Colombia. But if people go to our website, there's a number of think papers on what does it mean to talk about a global just transition? How do we plan better for workers and their families?
Thank you so much. We came to the right person to ask that tough question in a country that stalled on just transition conversation until after the Alberta election, it seems. So thank you to everyone for your questions. It's time to move on to Leah, if we might, to just recap some of the suggestions for possible actions following from this meeting. So with thanks to both our speakers, over to you, Leah.
Huge thank you to our speakers. I'm sure that a lot of us will be going back and rewatching the recording to catch things that we may have missed. So thank you so much. I think it's very telling that both of these organizations have sort of an arm that is specifically for faith groups to get involved, because they recognize that faith groups have a unique role and a special important role to play in this conversation. So I wanted to reiterate for everyone, because the whole purpose of this webinar is what next? What can we do? So Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. If you visit fossilfueltreaty.org, you can sign on to that treaty. You can do it as right now today as an individual. And please start the process with your organizational leadership teams to endorse this also at sort of as a congregation or as an organization. And if you visit fossilfueltreaty.org/faith-letter, again, you can sign there as well as an individual or as an institution. So please do that. For Stop Ecocide Canada, you can join the movement. Go to stopecocide.earth/Canada. There is information and resources there. You can sign up to endorse their work. There's a letter on there that is looking for institutional sign-ons to the Canadian government, calling for the criminalization of ecocide. And also a reminder, go to the faithforecocidelawr.earth/join. And again, there you will be able to join faith groups from across the globe who are working on this initiative as well. And then Louise mentioned you can also send an email to canada@stopecocide.earth for more training and resources to get involved in that. All of these links will be sent out to you next week, along with the recording from today. So that'll make a nice little package that you can forward on. You can share with your colleagues. You can share with your leadership teams, your boards of directors, people who are making those decisions at that level. Looking at next steps for GEM, Joint Ecological Ministry, we want to continue to bring relevant, wonderful speakers, such as we've had today, to you. And so we would like to get a sense from you of what you want to look at next, who you would like to hear from next. So if you go to, I'm going to drop the direct link in the chat right now, but if you go to menti.com and you enter the code 43344925, it will take you to a survey where you can let us know what areas interest you. So I'll give you a minute here to do that. And when you go to that website, you'll have, there are 4 options that we've identified as areas that are in keeping with the themes that we've been talking about up to now. So critiquing the government's Just Transition Act, shutting down fossil fuel production, reviewing the government's net zero plans, and preparing for the COP28 climate talks. So you can rank those in order of your interest. So the one that you pick first versus second, third, fourth. So we've had 4 responses so far, but we do still have 56 people on the call. So please do, I know we're running out of time, but please do complete that so that we can see your results. I will let that continue to run as we close out our event today. If there is anybody on the call who is not on our email list, the Joint Ecological Ministry email list, if you found out about this webinar some other way and you would like to join our list, I've just popped a link in the comments where you can go and you can sign up for our email list. We are specifically like a faith-based group, so the types of events that we will be bringing, we'll be looking at how faith groups can respond to the ecological crisis today. So that's all for me. I'll pass it back over to Joe.
Well, thanks to Leah, and thanks to the organizers of the event. I think all of us feel a great appreciation for the 2 speakers that we've had today. It's been wonderful. As Leah said, you will get information as a summary and the recording so that we can continue to work together. And let's continue to be in touch and continue this really, really important work. I thank everyone for your participation and for your discipline in keeping to 90 minutes, which has been really, really full. So with appreciation to all, have a very, very good weekend. And thank you so much again.